For 8 straight nights, something changed over the Persian Gulf. No ballistic missiles streaking toward American bases, no drones falling out of the dark sky over Kuwait, no tanker explosions logged by maritime monitors in the Strait of Hormuz. After more than a year of strikes, counterstrikes, and a war that has killed thousands, Iran has gone quiet. Washington is calling it progress. A peace deal, mediators in Islamabad say, is closer than it has ever been, with a hard deadline now just days away. But inside intelligence circles, a different question is being asked, one with far less comfortable answers. Is this silence the sound of a country finally standing down, or the sound of a country regrouping somewhere the world isn't watching closely enough? The uncomfortable part is that this would not be the first time. Iran has gone quiet before, during earlier ceasefires in the same war, and in at least one case, that silence was later revealed to have been anything but empty. Understanding what is really happening this time means going back through a year that has already reshaped the Middle East more than any single stretch of time since the Arab Spring, a year that saw a decades-old regime lose its supreme leader in a single airstrike, spend more than a week unable to confirm who was actually in charge, and still somehow keep fighting. To understand why that question matters, it helps to go back to where this war actually began, because the story did not start with missiles. It started with a negotiation that collapsed. In April 2025, American and Iranian officials sat down in Muscat, Oman, for the first real talks in years over Iran's nuclear program, led on the American side by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Those talks dragged on for weeks, moved briefly to Rome, and ultimately fell apart by June. Under the old 2015 nuclear agreement that the first Trump administration had already withdrawn from years earlier, Iran had once accepted strict caps limiting enrichment to just under 4%, a level suitable only for civilian power reactors. By 2025, none of those caps remained in force, and the International Atomic Energy Agency's own reporting showed Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%, a short technical step from weapons grade, had grown substantially in the years since the agreement collapsed. When the June 2025 talks broke down, the United States carried out direct strikes on 3 of Iran's most important nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, dismantling much of the above-ground infrastructure Iran had spent nearly 2 decades building. Israel had already launched its own war days earlier, describing Iran's nuclear and missile programs as an existential threat to its survival. For 12 days, missiles flew in both directions, some intercepted by American and Israeli air defenses, others reaching their targets before a ceasefire took hold. It did not last. Within months, both sides were exchanging fire again, setting the stage for a far larger and more destabilizing campaign the following year. By early 2026, the pressure inside Iran was building on 2 fronts at once, an economy strained by decades of sanctions and a population reaching a breaking point. In late December 2025, protests erupted across the country, driven largely by runaway inflation and the crushing cost of daily life. Within 2 weeks, demonstrations had spread to more than 185 cities in every one of Iran's 31 provinces. The government's response followed a familiar pattern. According to Reuters and independent human rights monitors, at least 2,000 people were killed and more than 16,000 arrested in the crackdown that followed. Then, on January 8, 2026, the regime did something it had never done at this scale before. It shut down the internet almost entirely, cutting mobile data, restricting cellular networks, and attempting to jam satellite services like Starlink. Cybersecurity researchers who have tracked internet blackouts globally since 2011 called it the most sophisticated and severe shutdown they had ever measured anywhere. It lasted, in various forms, for more than 4 months, costing Iran's own economy an estimated $35 million a day by the government's own admission. That blackout would later matter for reasons that had nothing to do with the protests that triggered it. On February 28, 2026, Israeli and American forces launched a new and far larger campaign, publicly named Operation Roar of the Lion, striking Revolutionary Guard command centers across Iran. This time, the assault wasn't limited to missiles and fighter jets. Iranian news sites, government digital services, and internal security communications collapsed almost simultaneously, and the monitoring group NetBlocks recorded internet traffic across the country plunging to just 4% of normal levels. Whether that collapse was caused entirely by a parallel cyber attack, by physical damage to infrastructure, or by the regime's own emergency shutdown protocols kicking in, has never been fully and independently confirmed. But Israeli officials later told American reporters that the blackout served a second purpose beyond crowd control. It hid, for critical hours and even days, exactly how much damage the strikes had actually done, and exactly who inside Iran's security establishment had survived. That second question turned out to be the one that would reshape the entire war. Among the targets struck that day was the official residence of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled the Islamic Republic for 37 years. The Iranian government did not confirm his death immediately. It took until March 1st, a full day after the strikes, for Tehran to acknowledge what Israeli and American intelligence had already concluded, that Khamenei was dead, killed alongside his daughter, daughter-in-law, grandchild, and son-in-law when his residence was destroyed. Israeli officials would later claim that the strikes had eliminated roughly 25 senior officials from Iran's Ministry of Intelligence in a single opening barrage, many of them killed while gathered together for a meeting, including the minister who had personally authorized the January internet shutdown. It was, by any measure, a decapitation strike aimed not just at weapon systems, but at the people who ran the regime's security and intelligence apparatus. What followed was a succession crisis without precedent in the Islamic Republic's history. Iran's constitution calls for a 3-person leadership council to govern in the interim, and one was assembled within a day, made up of the country's president, its judiciary chief, and a senior cleric. But the deeper uncertainty centered on one man, Khamenei's son, Mojtaba. He had reportedly been injured in the same strike that killed his father, and for weeks afterward, he made no public appearances. A silence so prolonged that even seasoned Iran analysts were left genuinely unsure whether he was alive. It was not until March 8th, more than a week after the strikes, that Iran's Assembly of Experts formally elected him the 3rd supreme leader in the Islamic Republic's history, ending an uncertainty that had left one of the world's most consequential governments effectively leaderless at the height of a war. Analysts who study the regime describe Mojtaba Khamenei as more hardline than his father, with closer ties to some of the country's most ideologically extreme clerics. Unlike his father, who spent decades building a public persona and a network of personal loyalties across the Revolutionary Guard, Mojtaba had operated for years, largely behind the scenes, holding an unofficial but powerful role coordinating on his father's behalf without ever occupying a formal government post, which earned him a nickname among Iran watchers, the Phantom of Tehran. He inherited a title that, in Iran's system, carries authority over the armed forces, the judiciary, and the country's entire foreign policy apparatus. What he actually controls, and how much power now genuinely rests with the Revolutionary Guard commanders who kept functioning, while the political leadership was in chaos, remains one of the least understood dynamics of this entire war. It is worth remembering, too, that Iran had only replaced a supreme leader once before in its entire history, when Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini died in 1989, and Ali Khamenei succeeded him through a managed, deliberate transition negotiated over weeks by the political establishment of the time. This transition had none of those advantages. It happened inside an active war, under bombardment, with dozens of the officials who would normally manage such a process already dead. While the world's attention stayed fixed on the leadership vacuum in Tehran, Iran's nuclear file quietly became both clearer and murkier at the same time. The International Atomic Energy Agency's Director General, Rafael Grossi, has said repeatedly that inspectors have found no direct evidence Iran is actively building a nuclear weapon. But he has also warned that Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to just below weapons grade remains a serious concern, and that Tehran's continued refusal to grant full access to its facilities means the agency cannot certify the program as exclusively peaceful, a distinction that matters enormously and gets lost in most of the daily war coverage. IAEA assessments following the original 2025 strikes found that the above-ground enrichment facility at Natanz had been destroyed, and that a related loss of power may have caused further damage to the buried infrastructure below it, while Isfahan's chemical laboratory, uranium conversion plant, and fuel manufacturing facilities were also confirmed damaged. What nobody has been able to verify with certainty is where Iran's pre-strike stockpile of highly enriched uranium actually is now, whether it was destroyed, buried, or moved before the bombs fell. That single unanswered question has haunted every round of ceasefire negotiations that followed. And there have been many rounds. A ceasefire announced in early April 2026, covering not just Iran, but Hezbollah's front in Lebanon, collapsed within hours, with Gulf states reporting new drone attacks before the ink on the announcement had even dried. Delegations met again in Islamabad on April 11th and 12th, in talks that ran 21 hours across 3 separate rounds, the first conducted indirectly through Pakistani intermediaries, before the two sides finally sat across from each other. Negotiators reportedly agreed on most points of a proposed 10-point framework, but 2 issues stopped them cold: the future of the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil traffic normally passes, and the terms under which Iran's nuclear program would be verified going forward. The talks ended without an agreement. It would not be the last time those same 2 issues derailed a deal that otherwise appeared close. By June, Pakistan's government was declaring that a final, agreed text had actually been reached, with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announcing that peace had never been closer. Trump administration officials, including Vice President J.D. Vance, pushed back publicly on reports suggesting Iran would receive any upfront financial benefit from signing, insisting no funds were being released before Iran met its obligations. Iran's foreign ministry, meanwhile, quietly signaled that its negotiating team had no immediate plans to travel anywhere to actually sign anything, a telling gap between the diplomatic announcement and the reality on the ground. That gap has defined the months since. A 60-day negotiating window established in mid-June is set to expire on August 16th, and as of this week, Pakistani officials say they are still scrambling to close the remaining distance, with Iran's newly appointed security leadership now conditioning any reopening of the Strait of Hormuz on sanctions relief, the release of frozen Iranian assets abroad, and firm guarantees against further military strikes, demands the United States has so far been unwilling to fully accept. It is against that backdrop of a looming, hard deadline that the recent quiet becomes genuinely strange. For 8 consecutive nights through early August, monitors tracking the conflict recorded no confirmed ballistic missile launches, no drone strikes on Gulf military installations, and no direct attacks on American forces. An unusually long stretch of calm in a war that had, just days earlier, seen Kuwait absorb consecutive dawn drone attacks and tankers struck near the Strait of Hormuz. On its face, that quiet looks like exactly what negotiators in Islamabad are hoping for, a sign that both sides are finally willing to let a deal breathe. But American and Israeli officials examining the pattern have raised a different possibility, one rooted in something Iran has done during nearly every previous lull in this war. According to Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers who spoke to the New York Times, the ceasefire that briefly held in April 2026 was used by senior Quds Force commanders not to stand down, but to hold direct calls with Hezbollah, Houthi, and Iraqi militia leaders, coordinating how to expand pressure on the United States without triggering a direct Iranian response that could draw fresh strikes on Iranian soil itself. That strategy reflects something important about how Iran actually wages war in this era, and it is the piece of this story that rarely gets the same airtime as missile counts and enrichment percentages. Iran's regional network, built over 4 decades by the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, is not a single chain of command, but a loose federation of allied groups with very different levels of independence. Hezbollah in Lebanon, still believed to hold well over 100,000 rockets and missiles, despite catastrophic losses since 2023, coordinates most closely with Tehran. Shiite militias in Iraq occupy a murkier middle ground, torn in recent months between loyalty to Iran and pressure from their own government to disarm, a split that hardened after Iraq's judiciary called on militias to hand their weapons to the state, a demand some factions accepted and others flatly rejected. And the Houthis in Yemen operate with the most autonomy of all, which is precisely why their actions have proven the hardest for either side to predict or control. The evidence of that strategy in action has piled up through the summer. On July 20th, the Houthis declared a maritime blockade against Saudi Arabia and began enforcing it with missile and drone strikes on commercial shipping, a threat that widened days later when drones struck tankers near the Suez Canal, an attack Iran itself denied ordering. By early August, monitoring groups had logged the 9th commercial vessel targeted since that blockade was declared, including a Liberian-flagged bulk carrier struck roughly 20 nautical miles off course, and a Saudi tanker hit off the port of Yanbu. Kuwait absorbed consecutive dawn drone attacks in the final days of July and the first days of August, its defense ministry calling one wave a heinous act of Iranian aggression, even as Tehran declined to claim responsibility. Joint American and Saudi strikes on Iran-aligned militias inside Iraq around the same period killed several fighters, photographed afterward in the green uniforms associated with the Quds Force, their coffins draped in Iranian flags, a visible reminder that even a formerly quiet front can turn lethal within hours. Analysts studying the network describe all of this as a deliberate strategy, using deniable, semi-independent partners to raise the economic and military cost of the war for Washington and its allies, while keeping Iran's own territory formally out of the line of fire, and while preserving just enough deniability that Tehran can claim publicly that it is honoring the peace. This is where the gap between what the public is watching and what actually threatens regional stability becomes most visible. Headlines and cable news chyrons track missile counts, drone intercepts, and enrichment percentages, because those numbers are countable and dramatic. But 3 quieter developments may matter more for what happens next. The first is the succession itself. An untested, more hardline leader whose actual command authority over Iran's fractured security services has never been fully tested in a real crisis, let alone a war. The second is the demonstrated willingness of Iran's Revolutionary Guard to use ceasefires, the very periods diplomats treat as evidence of de-escalation, as operational cover to rebuild proxy coordination. And the third is the sophistication Iran displayed in controlling information itself, using an internet blackout not just to suppress its own citizens during protests, but, according to Israeli intelligence assessments, to obscure the true extent of military damage from a foreign adversary in the middle of an active war. A regime capable of that kind of narrative control during a crisis is not simply reacting to events. It is actively managing what the outside world, including American intelligence analysts, is able to see in real time. None of this means the current quiet is necessarily deceptive. It is entirely possible that 8 days without missile fire genuinely reflects exhaustion on both sides. An Iranian government focused on securing sanctions relief before its economy buckles further, and a fragile but real opening for the deal Pakistan's mediators have spent over a year trying to close. Oil markets, watching for any sign of how this resolves, have pushed prices higher for 6 consecutive days, specifically because traders are unsure which outcome is more likely. What can be said with confidence is only this, that Iran has used quiet periods strategically before, that its internal chain of command is less transparent right now than at almost any point in the Islamic Republic's history, and that the security officials with the deepest institutional memory of running this war, the men who survived the February strikes, answer to a supreme leader whose public track record is barely 5 months old. There is also an unresolved question sitting quietly underneath all of it, one that virtually no official on either side has addressed directly. President Trump said in June that Iran's supreme leader had personally approved the framework for a peace deal. That statement was made while Ali Khamenei's assassination was already public knowledge, which means the approval in question, if it happened at all, would have come from either the Interim Leadership Council or from Mojtaba Khamenei himself in the earliest, most uncertain days of his rule, a period when his own government was still confirming whether he was alive. Whether a deal negotiated in those chaotic weeks still reflects the priorities of an Iranian leadership that has since had months to consolidate power is a question with no clear public answer, and it is one reason Pakistani mediators have described the final stretch of these talks as being as fragile now as at any point since the war began. The economic clock is running just as loudly as the diplomatic one. Oil prices have climbed for 6 consecutive days as traders weigh the odds of either outcome, a reminder that the Strait of Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a substantial share of its liquefied natural gas, and that even a partial disruption ripples through economies that have nothing directly to do with this war. Gulf states that have already absorbed missile strikes, drone attacks, and a blockade declaration have their own reasons to want this resolved quickly, and their diplomats, alongside Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and China, have all played some role in trying to nudge Washington and Tehran back to the table whenever talks have stalled. That crowded diplomatic effort is itself a sign of how much is riding on the next few days, and how little margin either side actually has left for another collapse. What happens in the days around August 16th will likely tell us more about the real state of this conflict than months of missile tracking ever could. If a deal is signed, and if the Strait of Hormuz genuinely reopens with verified nuclear restrictions in place, it will represent one of the more remarkable diplomatic turnarounds of the decade, ending a war that has already killed thousands, upended Iran's leadership structure entirely, and reshaped the regional balance of power in ways that will take years to fully understand. If it collapses again, as it has twice already this year over the same 2 unresolved issues, the 8 quiet nights recorded in early August may be remembered not as the moment peace finally took hold, but as the pause before Iran's proxy network, rebuilt during exactly this kind of lull before, resumed the fight through partners Tehran can deny controlling. Either way, the story of this war has never really been the one told by missile counts and satellite footage of bomb craters. It has been the story of a government that lost its leader in a single strike, spent more than a week unable to confirm who was even alive to replace him, quietly used its own information blackout to control what the outside world could see of the damage, and somehow kept fighting anyway. Through partners, it can always deny commanding. The nuclear question, the one that started this war in the first place, is still not fully answered, and Rafael Grossi's inspectors still cannot say with certainty where Iran's pre-strike uranium stockpile has gone. But the quieter, harder question, the one without a clean number attached to it, is whether the world is actually watching the right thing at all. Missiles are counted, enrichment percentages are measured, a new supreme leader's grip on a fractured security state, and what his commanders choose to do the next time everyone assumes the war has finally gone quiet cannot be counted the same way. That may be the most dangerous unknown left in this conflict, not how many centrifuges Iran has left, but who is actually giving the orders now, and how much of what happens next the rest of the world will even get to see before it's already underway.